Welcome to the Woman Who Rubs the Mountain podcast, a gathering place for conversations and stories of ecological embodiment. I am your host and guide, Kendra Ward. Our explanations and explorations begin with this single question: what happens when we rub on the body of the earth? How does it brush back against us? Here we seek an intimacy with the land and beings where we live, an intimacy that transcends language, culture, species, even consciousness. Let us come together in creative, strange, disruptive ways of relating beyond the human-centric limitations of our current dreamings. By sharing experiences of embodied ecology, our reality shifts, our core truths sharpen, and space is made for new, old, earth-honoring culture to reemerge. And you, dear listener, can join me in this animist celebration. So I'd love for you to share your explorations of earth-honoring revelry in spoken or written word to the story cauldron. And go ahead and listen all the way through, or you can go to kendraward.com to get all of the details. So I'm super excited and honored to be in conversation today with Kristine Backes. Kristine left a corporate communication and leadership development career to become a teacher, astrologer, and healer rooted in nature-based traditions such as astrology and Ayurveda. She hosts the Natural Wisdom podcast and offers classes and consultations to help people find radical well-being by remembering themselves as an integral part of the living world and its rhythms. In addition to her studies in astrology and Ayurveda, she is also a yoga teacher, Reiki master, and holds a master's degree in organizational leadership. So I'm so happy to share this space with you, Kristine.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here and talk about things that are so near and dear to our hearts.
I know a lot of good overlap for sure. So I'd love to ground us just in learning a little bit more about where you are. So what the new and old name of the place where you live, what they are.
Well, people will recognize where I live because I'm about 50 miles north of Yellowstone National Park. So I'm really in that break point between mountains and plains, between the Rocky Mountains and the plains. And so that helps orient. A lot of tribes shared this area before they were pushed on to reservations. The Crow tribe is one that's probably the most predominant, but the mountains, the Absaroka Mountains, are named after that tribe. And Apsaalooke horses are also come from that same name, that same root at least. And then the other thing that people might not know is that the Yellowstone River used to be called the Elk River because we are full of elk here still, although not quite obviously in the same numbers. And of course, it's a pretty common occurrence to see bison both inside and outside of the park. And so we still have some connections to those roots. But there's a lot of sacred places in the mountains here. And once you start spending time here, not only do you kind of hear about that, but you also can feel why they were sacred, how they're sacred, and feel that sacredness.
Beautiful. Yeah. Well, I'm curious about just learning a little bit more about this land and just how you engage with it, especially from an embodied way. So how you connect through your body in particular.
Well, I'm fortunate enough that my parents, some 40 some years, 50 years ago or whatever it was, bought a little piece of property. And so my brothers and I share ownership of that, and I'm the one that lives close. So I actually spend a lot of time in that area, on that land. And I pretty much just know the land, the animals, the kind of the cycles. And the way both my Ayurvedic background and my astrology background kind of help me understand the rhythms of the land and the rhythms of the natural world. And so a lot of it is just really celebrating those rhythms and allowing my life to align with those rhythms. Simple things like changing the diet, right? You change your diet every season because what's in season changes. And being connected to that piece of land, it means that I usually try to gather nettles every spring, for instance, and make nettle soup or nettle tea. Or in the summers when I'm hiking up in that area, I might grab the nettle seeds and have a little snack on the trail because they're very energizing. And then I make medicine in the fall usually from the hawthorn bushes and the rose hips and whatever else. There's just, everything is medicine, right? And there's different ways of working with it. And plants are probably the most accessible. But there's also, there's animal medicine as well. And sometimes the animal medicine comes just from seeing them and connecting with them. Sometimes it comes from finding the tooth of a bear in the creek. Sometimes it comes from finding an entire elk skeleton, whole and preserved, coming out of the snow in the spring. I mean, those have all been my experiences, and those are ways that I connect. And sometimes it's as simple as almost literally rolling around in the moss when it feels good.
I love that. Yeah, I've had a tremendous urge to introduce the nettles recently, and so nothing is. I think I have a friend who recently harvested just the tiniest baby nettles, but I have some dried nettles from last year that I've kind of been digging. Actually, you know what? I've got some here this morning.
There. Oh.
Yeah. So yeah, I really relate to that, and I think it's such a joy to see what comes out of the snow. What you might discover and what might be left over. Because, like for example, the deer antlers. I know that they're all eaten up by the mice and the other little creatures for calcium and everything else. So even to find anything left is kind of a joy of sorts.
Right. Yeah. It always feels like a gift to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And of course, that's how I think that's the way that we, as you called it, earth honoring, that's the way we honor it, is by understanding that it is a gift. It's freely given, but it's also very useful to be grateful.
Yeah.
Just because it's that relationship. And I think, back to the question that you asked about, kind of getting that connection, a lot of it is just, as you've talked about in your first episode and throughout your website, it's about kind of getting through practice and the mental construct, but also through the heart and the body, really understanding that everything is a being, everything is alive, and we're in relationship with all of it, whether we know it or not. And so once we start honoring that relationship, it becomes more real to us. Whether it's the elk or the bee or the blade of grass or the rock, whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm really curious to feel more into just how you blend it all together. So I loved reading the story of the dream that you had the night before your first astrological reading, and it sounds like that was like a big download, a turning point for you. Something I love the just sort of the instinctual nature of that. Something sort of undisputable within yourself that arose. So, just really curious how you use or how the language of astrology to you helps you break down sort of our cultural idea around separation. And it's particularly interesting to me because I think that many folks, when they're seeking out an astrological reading, it can feel very self-focused, or individually focused, sort of
Mm-hmm.
like, tell me about, reveal things to me. Tell me about my tendencies, or that imprint of the map of the cosmos. But we can oftentimes approach it in a way that is very much about the individual instead of about the whole. So just really
Right.
curious how you pull that all together.
Yeah. Okay. Let me back up for just a moment for the people that are listening. The dream, I'll just give you the short version of the dream because it is kind of interesting. I was just starting in my studies of astrology, and the night before my first reading with my mentor, the dream I had was that I had a star-shaped cell phone in my hand, but the user interface, the screen was busted. And I kept looking at it thinking, well, how am I going to make it work if the screen is broken? And I woke up in the morning thinking, I know astrology, I just don't remember it. I've got to remember it. And so for me, it has truly been a process of remembering.
Mm.
And there's a bunch of ways to answer your question. One is that you have to remember that, and of course, you know this all too well, in our culture, we categorize and separate. That's what we do with our language and our thought. And so astrology in the modern world certainly has a piece of that there's psychological astrology, and there's medical astrology, and there's this kind of astrology, there's spiritual astrology, but they're all from the same map, right? They're all from that same chart. Well, if you look at a natal chart, you can see the body, you can see the mind, you can see the soul. And that's one thing that we just kind of have to keep in mind. And as astrologers, it's kind of our job to remind people that it's all connected. And then so that's a piece of it. And then the other thing is that we can attune to the planets, right? We can attune to the cosmos. It's in us. That's what the astrology chart shows us, is that the planets and their energy patterns are within us as well as without, right? It's the as above, so below, as without, so within, the ancient dictum. But then once we start to pay attention, we can feel them in our bodies, and we can feel them through sensation. I did a whole podcast episode on sort of what do the planets feel like, and it was just a quick tour of them. But for instance, the moon's probably the easiest, right? For one thing, it moves the quickest. For another thing, it reflects our inner world. So what we might notice if we wanted to start paying attention to astrology is, if we don't have a chart and we don't know what our moon sign is, we can just notice what phase the moon is in, and what comes up for us every month as the moon goes through those phases. As women, of course, our cycles tend to sync up with the moon, but so do men's. It's just that it's not as visible. So we can start there. If we have a chart, have our own chart, and have access to the internet, all you have to do is kind of go check out. You could just do a query, where's the moon today? And you can get the sign, and then you can plug that into your chart and see where it is, and then notice your cycles based on your own chart. Oh, if the moon's near my sun, how do I feel? If the moon's near my moon, how do I feel? And what I've learned through my years of teaching it and doing these readings is that when I start, like I just did a class on Neptune last month, I guess it was. And I know what Neptune feels like, and I kind of know what starts to show up in my life. But when I did the class, it was front and center the whole time, because however you envision this, you can envision them as external entities, but of course they are also internal entities. And the analogy, I know this is a stupid analogy, but the analogy I use is that, like, if you go to buy a new car, or new to you, if you're looking at a specific make and model of car, all of a sudden that's all you see on the road, right? You see them all over. You might never have noticed them before. It's the same thing if you start studying Saturn. All of a sudden you notice, oh, I'm feeling pressure, or oh, I'm feeling these limitations, or oh, this is what it's like to be in form. Those are all Saturn meanings, and you just start to feel them. So it's this attunement process. And it's that way with everything in nature, right? If you're really a tree person and you love trees and you spend a lot of time just paying attention to trees, you can really attune to that tree energy. And just like nettles, like we were talking about, um, it's a little bit easier with something in physical form in front of you, to figure out how to really attune with nettles or a plant. But it's not different really than how you're attuning with the planets. And of course, there's an entire um, discipline of astroherbalism where you can start to see the correspondences between the plants and the planets. Nettles is a Mars plant, right? So you can start to understand that you're ingesting I mean, there's more energies in it, right? Because everything is made up of all energies. But when you ingest nettles, you can understand that you're ingesting Mars in a certain way, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Well, yeah. I know that the practice of using spagyrics really gets into this even in greater depth, and I'm just in awe because it gets so detailed.
Yeah.
In terms of just the timing of what you're doing when, according to what cycles, and yeah, it just to me as an outside observer, it feels very complicated, but also incredibly um, kind of just watchful and um, that the waiting for the right energies to have their impact on that alchemical process. So it's pretty
Right.
fascinating. It really, really is.
Right. Yeah, and I don't, I'm sure you've probably stumbled across Sage-Apopum and the School of Evolutionary Herbalism, but I would definitely, for people that are interested in that connection between plants and planets and using natural cycles and alchemy for creating the most powerful form of medicine, he and his wife and his whole crew, that it's a brilliant school, and they're just and there's a lot of indigenous knowledge from cultures around the world wrapped into his teachings, and he has a book as well. So I mean, I couldn't recommend his work enough for people that want to follow that path. I'm like you. For me, it's a little well, of course, a lot of people look at astrology and think it's really complicated, and it's a vast field, right? I'll never consider myself an expert. I don't go down the herbalism route and the spagyrics route because you can only do so many things in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I'm also not that quantitative of a person to really want to focus on it that way. But, astrology, I think I'll probably be a lifelong learner in. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, is there any other ways that like the a style or any other words that would describe kind of I mean, once again, this is the ways in which we try and box things up and kind of have like,
mm-hmm.
we separate the wrist from the elbow from the shoulder, and like it's the same way in our thinking. Um, but just sort of curious, continuing to kind of keep that thread going of how you um, kind of pull it all together for people and just and even for yourself, sort of, are there any like practices or rituals or ways that you work to disrupt this sense of separation, and like, because I think there's so many different ways we could go about it. We could go about it in really paying attention to our language, really paying attention to like our continued thought process, even in saying like um the ways that we talk about the land where we are, like we like it's ours, like we own it, little things like
Right.
that. I think we're continuing to disrupt. Just sort of curious what's up for you these days in terms of that disruption process, and just the ways in which we can push back against the unconscious return, the ways we kind of we continually return to this sense of separation?
Yeah, gosh, there's a lot up for me right now. I'm trying to wrap more of my spiritual work into the astrology work. And there's a new phrase in the spiritual community. It's not a new concept, but it's obviously starting to take root a little bit more. And that's called integrated enlightenment or integrated awakening. And it seems to me that there's finally, even in the more new agey community, like this recognition that there's no separation between spirit and matter, essentially. And so I'm building classes and offerings that are more clear, I guess, about that, and starting to bring that more to the fore. And in fact, my last episode on the podcast talked about karma, because that's one of the places where people like to divide and split and separate and misunderstand and misuse, is that whole concept of karma. So that's one of the things I'm doing, is trying to wrap more together. It's, for a long time I thought, well, how in the world am I ever going to integrate Ayurveda and yoga and astrology? But the truth is, they're all ways of relating to the world as a whole, as an integrated whole. Yoga is it's not seen that way in our culture, but it is a spiritual technology. Yoga is not a physical body thing. I mean, obviously there's a physical component to it, but it's a spiritual technology. It's about realization of who you really are and integration of all the parts. So what yoga, the word, means to yoke, right? To pull together, to connect. And then Ayurveda is the health, the medical science, that sister science to yoga. They go together. Ayurveda promotes longevity and like the very specific ways that we harmonize with the earth. And for instance, what I said earlier about changing our diet with the seasons and what's based on what's local and what's seasonal. That's one of the fundamental tenets of a nature-based system like Ayurveda, is how do I live in harmony with nature and nature's cycles? And then when I have pulled that into my astrology to some degree, it's a little tricky, because I'm a Western astrologer and I'm using Eastern concepts and trying to pull them together. But when you look at an astrology chart, all of the signs are divided into elements and modalities. And the elements are similar. There's 4 classical elements that we typically work with in astrology, whereas in Ayurveda, there are 5 elements. But there are 3 modes in astrology, and they are pretty much parallel to the 3 doshas in Ayurveda. So that's one of the ways that I like to bring things together, is to just see the parallels and see how they show up. And of course, when you're dealing with a human being or any other life force, any other form, whether it's the table, or of course, I'm probably not going to do a reading for the table, but if you're trying to see the elements and how they show up, you can do that with any life force. And then the chart is just a map of that. To me, astrology pulls it all together, because it's got the elements in it. It's got the modes. It's a similar languages, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Go
yeah.
ahead.
Well, I was going to say the one thing I say at the beginning of most of my classes is that there's a quote from a statistician about 100 years ago that I love, and it's that all models are wrong, but some are useful. Right. So Western science is a model. It's whether it's the chemical, physical, biological, it's a model of the world. It's not the world itself. It's just a way of describing it. Astrology is a model. It's a way of describing the world. All these things are models. And when we understand that we're just using imperfect models and imperfect language, that's the other thing that points us back to our own experience. How do I experience it? And then what we're doing is trying to figure out, how do I give language to it so that I can talk to somebody else?
Yeah, I really love that. I really love just that aspect of bringing it back to our own intuition and free will, and
Yes.
being able to use it in the ways that it speaks truth to us, and then be able to kind of also
Mm.
catch the ways in which it's just yet another system or paradigm or something that's been set up, that has its stopping point or its limitation of sorts.
Right.
So yeah, I really, this year in particular, what's been coming up for me really strongly is the connections between Mars, Aries season, and the liver element, from the five element perspective of Eastern
Mm.
medicine. So, not Ayurveda, but sort of more of the work that I've been involved in the last couple decades of Eastern medicine. Um, and I feel like people often ask this question of, well, what's most valid? Because there's all these systems, and then some have five
Oh,
elements and some have four. And um, how do we how do we make peace with that of sorts? And it it really helps to back off
yep.
from getting too involved in like the black and white thinking of this is how it is. And um, I even like to play with the language, for example, of the wood element, or liver energy, the springtime energy, of calling it, the tree element, or,
Mhm.
just changing the language entirely, not trying to get overly fixated in, it having to show up and look this very certain way. And so just finding the energetic blending, the energetic crossover, the ways in which things merge, the overlays between all these different systems, because there are connection points,
Right.
similarities in energy, and whatever we want to call them in particular. I mean, that's great and all, but just seeing the themes in a broader sort of way feels really important. And also just continuing to catch the ways in which we compartmentalize these different
Right.
energies. So we forget that, water nourishes and feeds, wood so it can grow, and then wood burns the ashes that create the fire element, and like the whole regenerative cycle, the way it's so interrelated that none of them are existing as these
Right.
individual elements, that they're all feeding each other, and they all are interdependent and need each other in order to kind of to keep it all going. So just once again, not getting too boxed up in the thinking of things. And that's something that I've really tried to lean into more over time, because when we first learn these things, it becomes very protocolized for us. But just really being able to, I've also heard it described as, we see the hand, we focus on the fingers, but we forget about the spaces in between. It's like,
Oh, that's beautiful.
we see
Yeah.
the stars, we're so
Yep.
focused on those pinpricks of light, but we forget about all that dark matter in between, which is really where like the juice of things lay. So, um, yeah.
Yeah, you just made me think about a dozen things. I mean, one is that again, when you think about our culture, and these are so karma, the definition of karma is action and consequence, right? And karma comes from what we believe. And what we believe, or what we like put our faith in, is the words that you would use, is often unseen. And one of the things that's really unseen in our culture, besides this concept of separation, right, that you and I are kind of bringing awareness to, is the concept of right and wrong, and
Mhm.
black and white. And from your studies that even the concepts of yin and yang, which are the duality, right? The polarity. They're separate in a way, but they're also each contains a seed of the other. And so it's the reminder that even in the model of duality and polarity, they're not actually separate. They contain each other. And so the reason I brought that up is that whole thing about, well, which system is right? When I first started studying, um, I got so confused about the house systems, and then the tropical astrology, which is what I study. uses the signs, which are not the same as the constellations, but Vedic or Jyotish astrology out of India, and sidereal astrology uses the constellations. And so people would argue with me, well, and of course we see this in the newspaper every year, so that, well, astrology is wrong because if your sun is, if they say you're a Scorpio sun, it's not really in Scorpio, it's in a different sign. Well, no, it's in a different constellation, but the signs are based on the seasons. So all this to say, I don't want to get off too much on that, but all this to say that I got really confused, as a lot of people do when I first studied. And so, well, how do I know which one's right? And bless her heart, my mentor, Emily Trinkus, said, they all work. There's just different systems. They all work, and you get what you get from each one. And so, you can, like Chinese medicine versus Ayurveda, it's confused me for years to try to understand the different 5 elements because they're very different. And the way they're used, similar, right? There's some similarities and some parallels, but they don't match up one to one, right? They just don't match up. But they're both work. And they both have tremendous wisdom in them. They're just different ways of modeling the world. And then I think the other thing I wanted to say is that, when you come back to that idea of what is your experience, in Ayurveda, there's a concept called the guna, and it means the qualities. And it's a set of 10 polarities. And so you would use, and those are what you would use to describe your experience. Is it heavy or light? Is it hot or cold? Is it mobile or static? And so when you get down to those fundamental building blocks and just how do you describe your experience? Well, we can spend an hour just talking about what does Saturn mean, right? But if you get down to your actual experience of things feel heavy right now, or things feel kind of restricted right now, or I'm feeling very focused or very committed. What are you feeling? What are you experiencing? And then that's where you can kind of get away from all the different descriptions of what Saturn is, and then just relate it to your own experience. And then, there's layers and layers. There's the mythology, there's the medical astrology piece. There's all these other pieces of it. But again, you can come back to just what is my experience right now, and how can I put that into context with what's going on astrologically, or what's going on with the elements, or whatever it might be. And the other thing I want to say is that it's a holographic universe. It's a holographic universe. I'm a holographic representation of the entire universe. A plant is a holographic representation of the entire universe. It's all in each one of us. And so if we remember that, that can help us kind of get past all the either or and the this is right, that's wrong, because it's all contained within each of us.
So tell me a little bit more about how you work that kind of knowing into your being. Just out of curiosity, it can be one thing we say that out loud, but then the difference between understanding that on the mental realm as a thought that we repeat to ourselves versus the ongoing integration into ourselves of knowing that. So I'm just curious in your daily life how you work with that.
Well, meditation is super helpful, and not meditation. Well, of course, there's so many different ways to describe it, but just the inquiry, like holding that inquiry when it comes up. I listened to for example, I listened to a presentation during the whole pandemic time about the microbiome, and this was, and just about, that component of us, that we're made up of all these living beings. We think that we're one human, right? We're not. We're an entire ecosystem. And so I listened to that, and then just spent time kind of trying to feel into, well, what does that mean? And I had this sort of a visceral understanding about that whole concept of no separation. I mean, you and I think that there's all this empty air maybe between me and the other person, but it is filled with living organisms. It is filled with life. It's filled with energy. It's filled with all sorts of things. And so sometimes it's just that contemplation and allowing your like your mind to soften a little bit. And of course, one of the ways I do that is by studying what different people say and being interested in a lot of different things. And then just kind of allowing the mental constructs to soften enough that something else can get in, right? Because that's part of it. But, you know, to me, some of the most useful daily practices that I've ever learned have been out of Ayurveda. And they're as simple as really paying attention to what's on my plate when I sit down to eat, just eating, right? Not doing other things when I eat. And I'm like everybody else. There are times that I do, but having that relationship with the food and again, sort of contemplating the food is alive, and each thing I'm eating is a being, of course, because it is, right? Contemplating where it came from and all the different entities that it took to get it to me. I mean, just those very simple things that all of us do every day, just because we're human, are the easiest ways to start to break down those barriers. And food, because it is of the earth, and because it is our fundamental connection with the earth, it's the most available way. Because even if you're not cooking it yourself, you're eating it. Even if you are eating at your desk, you still have the capability to maybe carve out some limited period of time where you're just focused on what you're eating. And it's not just this mechanical, unconscious act. And it, you know, coming back to your whole thing about earth honoring and embodied ecology, in Ayurveda, actually one of my favorite quotes about digestion is that digestion is the way we turn, and I'm going to paraphrase, earth consciousness into human consciousness. It's a transformational process. But we, again, in our culture, it's become, what's happened is we've started likening our bodies to vehicles, right? Just like a car. So we think, oh, we're just putting gas in the car. Well, even that could be a reverential task, right? But when it's your body and it's food, if you understand that what you're doing is taking in the earth, and the way you treat your food and the way you treat your body directly relates to the way you treat the earth. Once you understand that intellectually and then start working with it, even if it's just once a week or once in a while, preferably more than just once a month or so, because things that you do more often are going to get more ingrained. But when you can approach daily life and your daily rituals with that sense of honor, when you get up in the morning, where's the sun, right? Again, this is an Ayurvedic concept as we align our daily rhythms and routines with the daily rhythms and routines of the rest of the world, the rest of the natural world. So we get up with the sun, we start winding down with the sun. We change with the seasons. You know, our days are shorter in the winter, our days are longer in the summer. That's not how our culture is built, but we have the capacity to at least be aware of it and then try to honor it. And to me, you know, when we think of ritual, I think a lot of times when we think about ritual, we think we have to go get a book or we have to go get a teacher. And then we have to have this really complicated process where if we don't do it right, we're not going to get the right results. And or we think of witchcraft, or we think of all sorts of, or we think of spagyrics and spagyric medicine, all these things that have these very specific methods. But ritual can be as simple as setting an intention and then taking intentional action. And so if you're wanting to co-create or to expand on that relationship with nature, it's about setting that intention and then just pick one thing, right? Just one thing. Maybe every day you water your plant with intention. Maybe every day you feed yourself at least at one meal with that intention and that consciousness around what you're doing. To me, that's the simplest. I mean, and if somebody's into like building altars, there's, a gazillion ways to do it, but to make it accessible and to make it accessible, it can be that simple. And that's what I'm a pretty simple person when it comes to that. I mean, I've done a few complicated rituals, but in terms of what I do every day, that's it.
I love that. I mean, I think that continuing to break down barriers or obstacles for people to just engage in the most basic of ways. Literally, I wake up in the morning and I place my hand on my heart
Yes.
and I greet this day as a vast universe of possibility. I think that it can be that simple, and sometimes it's really important to just make it that simple for ourselves,
Yes.
because we can be overwhelmed with expectation or ideas around making it really, really complicated. I really appreciate that reminder, of intention setting and just bringing it down to the earth, like really keeping it basic. And I just loved your descriptions around digestion and digesting earth consciousness this way. And in my family, and I have two children, and it really is this ongoing practice of, when we sit down for dinner, tuning into the life of this plant before us. What has it seen? What does it know? What did it experience? What are its ancestral memories? Let's dream on its family, and and then of course being able to give thanks for its life force and the way that it feeds our life force.
Right.
So yeah, just keeping it that simple. If we did it, if we tuned in regularly on that level, that's enough.
Right. It would completely change our relationship with the earth if more of us tuned in at mealtime and did exactly what you just described, that, honoring whatever we're eating, whether it's animals or plants or a combination of both. It's the relationship and the honor with which we do that matters.
Mm-hmm.
If you're honoring, well, again, whether it's a plant or an animal, if you're honoring it when you take it into your body, then you're much more likely to buy more responsibly or to eat more responsibly. If you're not growing your own, you're trying to find people that practice reverence, again, whether it's animal or plant.
Yeah, and I really like the practice of, in myself, one thing that I try and work with regularly is trying to say thanks before I actually walk the path, or I have a family of stones that I like to visit regularly, big ancient boulders. And so this practice of giving thanks, leaving an offering before I actually sit in conversation or just sit in presence with these other beings. So it's difficult. Sometimes I mess it up. I'm just like, I just plow right through, because that's kind of our training, is to say thank you afterwards, or like we say our prayers at the end of the day before sleep, or it's like that's kind of the old training. And so instead, really trying to work with that practice of like, stop before I take action, or before I extract or take, or kind of gather for myself in some way, being able to just have that moment of presence, and do the thanks and the respect then. So trying to, before eating, just having that moment of tuning in, in
Yep.
in acknowledgement.
Tuning in, acknowledging. Yeah, the other thing that I've realized by spending time, I don't know where it came from, right? Is that everything just wants to be appreciated.
Mm,
Everything wants to be appreciated. And again, I always think about the table, the computer, the pillow, the blanket, the tree, the soil, whatever. It just wants appreciation,
mm,
right? So
yeah.
if we kind of just walk around in appreciation, it makes such a big difference. It might
Hmm.
sound odd, but it just makes such a big difference. And it's, I mean, these are little things that are truly life changing.
Hmm.
They really are, and they're not just life changing for us, but they're life changing for everyone when we start really trying and practicing appreciation, practicing gratitude,
Hmm.
and practice. And again, it's partly, I think, what you're talking about, that that thanking before. It's the practice that helps us sort of internalize the sense that everything is a being just like us.
Hmm.
Right? Because again, as you said, how do we get it out of just the intellectual? Well, you get things out of the intellectual by making some kind of actual practice, by putting it into practice. If you talk to trees long enough, your whole being is going to start recognizing them as beings, as persons, or whatever word we would use, as conscious.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even if
It's
the
true.
first few times you do it, it seems kind of dumb. But if you do it long enough, it just becomes part of your world, right? Again, we're back to that karma, part of your conditioning.
Hmm.
Really, what we're doing is unconditioning ourselves and then sort of like reconditioning ourselves.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Figuring out what stories don't hold truth for us anymore and what
Exactly.
stories we want to invite in their place.
Yep.
Yeah, and to me, it feels like in the world, there's so much that's dissolving, dismantling, dissolving, falling apart, and so sometimes it can feel entirely overwhelming. Uh, and I've heard it described as, if we've been living the dream, sort of this through this, sort of white man's patriarchal view, illusion of the world, like what is the different dream? What are we living through instead? And it's that moment of amazing possibility, but also the overwhelmingness of, um, you know, it's so big. It's just, there's so much.
Which is
To,
why it's so important to come back to that holographic universe, and what I do matters, right? If I'm a holograph of the universe, and this is, I mean, I think it was the Buddha, right? That when he had his moment of enlightenment, he said, I and all beings are enlightened. And it's not a concept that I can even say I get, except intellectually, but it's that concept that what I do reflects through the entire universe. So if I'm paying attention to my practices, then it does change the world. And I think that's where we have to come back to when it gets overwhelming. Because if you read the newspapers on any regular basis, of course you're overwhelmed.
mhm.
Um, yeah, and that's a whole nother subject, but there's something else I wanted to say about that. Now it just left me.
Mhm.
But it's that idea that well, and actually it's kind of back to that concept of integration as well. Is that, again, if it's the view of separation, right? Out there, and the world and all the horrible things going on in the world, versus what's in here, and that they're a reflection of each other. So if I can work with this realm, this inner realm, this personal realm, it does reflect into the outer realm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's really helpful to, like, once again, grounding it in the simple moments that
Yeah.
like, especially, yeah, like you said, when we feel overwhelmed, just continuing to tune into the vast amount of possibility within ourselves, the vast
Yeah.
opportunity there. So, well, I'm curious what, if there's any particular being or element or something that you're engaging with regularly in the place where you live that's just bringing you a lot of joy right now, or something that is allowing you to connect with a sense of intimacy and love.
Well, I moved. So as I told you, I'm in Livingston, Montana, and I just moved here full time about 7 years ago, I guess it was. But we've been coming to these mountains here since I was 4. The mountains they feel like me, if that makes sense. They feel like
Ooh.
me, and I guess vice versa in a sense. I read an article once about shamanic a shamanic view of mental health, and this person talked about like crises where a particular energy was like trying to become part of you, so because that was the medicine you were going to carry. And I realized when I read that the mountains are the medicine I carry. And so they're also the medicine for me, right? It doesn't take all I have to do, and I can see them, but if I can go the 15 miles and actually get on the land, it doesn't take very long for me to just feel like me again.
Hmm.
And so the mountains in general, and there's a particular mountain where we live, or where we have the land, where we care for the land, where you could say we're the stewards of the land. It's probably the best way I know to say it. So that there's that, but then there's so many, there are many beings, and it comes in phases. Sometimes it's elk, sometimes it's bears, sometimes
Mhm.
it's deer, sometimes it's marmots. Lions, mountain lions are an animal that I have a connection with, that I see pretty often. And I'll just tell you a story of how it all came together last summer at the Leo new moon, which is in August.
Okay.
So about 20 minutes after the Leo new moon, and of course, as an astrologer, in fact, that was part of the reason I was up in the mountains at that time. I was sitting on the porch of our family cabin, and I saw an animal come up from the creek, probably about 100 feet away. And for a couple of minutes, it was just far enough away that it didn't look right. It was too small, too short to be a mountain lion. It had kind of biggish ears. So I thought maybe it was a deer because they're about the same color. And then as it saw me, and we stared at each other for a while. And then as it came closer, I realized it was a mountain lion, but it was a young one. And
Mm.
it came up and sat in the yard about, I don't know, 30 or 40 feet away for a good 5 or 10 minutes, just staring at me and then looking around. It kind of made me laugh because, it should have been afraid of me, but it wasn't. That's how I knew, one of the ways I knew it was young.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And so fine. And I went in, got my phone, took a video, talked to it for a while. And then it left. And then about 5 minutes later, a big one came through, in not exactly in the same place. And of course, it was much smarter. We looked at each other for about 2 seconds, and then it just disappeared. I've never seen an animal that can literally disappear like a mountain lion.
Wow.
You
Uh-huh.
don't even see it going. It's just in 1 second it's there, and then it's gone. Even if you're watching it, I don't know how they just do it. So it was just one of these very, and I don't know that I took a lot of meaning from it. And, it's one of those things that over time it'll filter in. It felt like a gift, right? Because this isn't a usual occurrence for most people,
Yeah.
even people that spend as much time as I do up there. So it felt like a gift, but it was such a weird crazy synchronicity that it happened at the Leo new moon. Of course, Leo means lion, right? I
Mhm.
have a Leo moon, and the new moon was close to my moon. And here were these lions just showing up for me in this weird way.
That's so
So,
cool.
yeah, and there's lots of stories like that, but that's the one that I think is one of the most dramatic, and interesting, and funny all at the same time.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. It's really fantastic. Talk about a great way of um, just engaging with the joy of an unexpected gift.
Right, right,
Yeah,
right. Yeah. And
yeah.
like I say, it happens with sometimes it'll go in waves and it'll be bears, and sometimes it'll be elk, and very close, like 20 or 30 feet often when I run into or moose. We have moose up there. Those are the
Mhm.
animate objects, and of course the animate life forms, and then there's lots of plants as well, but they typically don't make for quite as dramatic stories.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well, tell us if there are any particular offerings that you wanted to just kind of share a description of for us, or if there's anything else that you're ways in which you're sharing your life force with the world that you wanted to tell us about before we close.
Sure, thank you so much for that. Well, my newest and probably the biggest focus of my gifts right now and my offerings is my podcast, and that's called the Natural Wisdom Podcast. And it has some similarities to yours in that what the idea is to really help people understand and remember themselves as nature. And so a lot of times it's just me talking. Last time I talked about karma and sort of this, yeah, and the karma that we create through this idea of separation from nature, for instance. And then a lot of times there's some astrology flavoring, what's going on, and then some basics. I've had an animal communicator on. I've had a herbalist who does a lot of plant communication on a couple of times, and just various folks like that. So that's my first love. And then, of course, I do readings and individual consultations, and those can be pretty much focused on whatever anybody wants. I don't consider myself a medical astrologer, but in terms of just general health practices, I definitely can talk to people about that based on the chart and then what's going on. And then I do classes. I've got a couple of them in the works, but they're still in the works. There's no dates and things set up. So people can subscribe to my newsletter through my website, which is just my name, KristineBackes.com. And you can also, I finally got the domain name for Natural Wisdom Podcast. So if you can't figure out how to spell Kristine Backes, you can go look up Natural Wisdom Podcast, and it should get you there.
And I'm going to share those links
Thank
as
you.
well. Yes, make it easier on everyone. So, well, beautiful. I have loved just connecting with you in this way. I really appreciate it.
It's been a fun conversation, Kendra. Thank you so much for having me on. And I love the whole idea of your podcast, and I'm looking forward to listening to more of it.
Thanks, Christine. Yeah. Well, just much gratitude to everyone for listening and for spending this time with us, and really for being willing to sort of struggle against your edges a bit as we find new ways of relating while also submerging ourselves in just a great love for this wild earth. And I would love to hear your stories, written, spoken, however you want to share them. Any of the ways in which you are discovering emergent, creative stories or experiences, practices, ways in which you're finding intimacy with the place where you live. So you can go to the podcast page at kendraward.com to just add your yarns, your poems, your revelations of sorts to the story cauldron. All right. Oceans of love to you, saying goodbye for now.